Hello, welcome to Computer Tech and More. Today we're going to be taking a look at the BeQuiet Light Wings 120mm high-speed version of the fan. Let's get right into the graphs and then we'll do our open box experience. Before we get into the graphs and the data, this is the raw spec information off of the manufacturer website, BeQuiet. So it's basically a bog standard 120mm fan, standard thickness of 25mm. It uses a rifle style bearing, 12 volts. Saw no amperage listed. Speed rating is from 400 to 2500 for the highest speed one. The normal one has a lower maximum speed, but this will still be applicable to it for its maximum RPM. And airflow is rated at maximum of 52.3 CFM, static pressure at 2.6, and a noise level by their readings of 31 decibels. Okay, first up in the graphs is my case simulation test. The case simulation test can be looked at in two primary ways. The first one, which the way I think of it, is how the fan actually pushes air out the back. So does it create a cylindrical shape where it's a nice cylinder of air being blown right out the back, which would be the most perfect fan in the world. So if there was no air resistance at all, it would create a perfectly straight line. That would be the most ideal fan. But the fan is pushing through air because there's air inside the case, and so you could expect some losses for it to decrease in air velocity. Now, you want the fan to have as linear and as slow a drop in airspeed as possible. That indicates the best performing fans because you want as high an airspeed right at the end where your CPU cooler is. That will greatly improve the performance of your CPU cooler to allow it to operate more efficiently, cool down your case, keep your components running at their ideal temperatures. And this is true for both air coolers and radiators, whether it's an AIO or custom loop. However, it is more important for a air-cooled type system. And the second way to look at it is basically is that case simulation. So I took 4 data points, 6 inches, 9 inches, 11 inches, and 14.5 inches. And each of those are representative of a different size case. 6 inches is representative of a small form factor type case that is still more or less a front to back type airflow. 9 inches is representative of a small compact case that is still a front to back standard type layout case. 11 inches is more like a mid tower, something like a Corsair 550D or Meshify 2C, and 14.5 inches is very much like the Fractal Design Torrent. This type of test is very specific on being good at case airflow. If a fan is bad at case airflow, you're going to see a fairly steep drop off in performance right here at the beginning, and then it'll level out to basically more or less 0 towards the end of the case. That would be indications of a very, very, very bad case fan. Well, how does this fan compare against my control? Once again, my control fan is based off of 3 parts, the A12X25, and 1 part, the Noctua A14. 2 fans that I consider to be quite good in their respective categories, and by mushing them together, I'm hoping to create this pretty good middle ground between 120 and 140 millimeter size fans to compare everything against. On the right side of the graph, we have our legend. We have the Light Wings High Speed 120, and we have the Silent Wings Pro 4 or 4 Pro, I forget which order that is, 120 millimeter fan. The Silent Wings 4 Pro is a blue line, that blue line. The control is this green line, and the Light Wings is the red line. So it's pretty clear that the Light Wings does pretty well at throwing air a short distance, but as you get farther away from it, it just doesn't perform quite as well as we would hope to see in a good case fan type design. But if you're blowing air through a radiator, such as in an AIO or a custom liquid cooling system, it may still do perfectly adequate because blowing air through a radiator, heatsink, whatever, tends to straighten out the airflow and negates the fact if a fan naturally tries to shoot air off to the sides. But we're going to get into more detail about this a little bit later on. Ramping things up to 100% PWM fan signaling, and we can still see that the Light Wings is still underperforming compared to my control fan. Mind, based on the results, it's not terrible, but there are just better fans out there, which we'll see now. Here are some very representative fans of what I consider to be good, middle, and not very good basically case fan categories. So at the bottom here we have the NF-S12B, which seemed to underperform terribly for me. The P12 from Arctic, and then right here is the Light Wings highlighted. And then we have sort of the better category, which includes things like the Wonder Snail, the Silent Wings 4 Pro, and the Noctua A12X25. Over here on the right side, we have the fan name with the RPM it was running at for my noise normalized value. Noise normalized for me is 40 decibels, which equates to the Noctua A12X25 running at 1,200 RPM in my old system. So in that system, I had an AIO that the fans blew through. There were two fans that were shooting out and was in a Corsair 550D case. And I just remember that the fans were particularly silent at around that 1,200 RPM mark. So that is what I used for my testing as my noise normalized value. Just simple like that. Ramping things up to 100% PWM fan signaling. Once again, on the right side in the legend, we have the fan name, the RPM I was running at, and the noise levels so that you can directly compare these fans against one another. So first off, the Light Wings and the A12X25 appear to be running at more or less the same RPM. Mine, there's a bit of a difference. The Light Wings is spinning a bit faster, and it's also producing a little bit less noise. But it's also, amazingly, not pushing quite as much air. The A12X25 is sitting right here, with the NF-S12B sitting right here at the bottom. The Unifan SL120V2 sitting, well, kind of even worse. So as a quick summary right here, I would say the Light Wings really isn't that great as a case fan. It's kind of in that okay category, but there's substantially better fans out there. Now we're taking a look at how the air travels through the case at the 9-inch mark for airspeed versus decibels. The 9-inch mark was chosen because it's a sort of middle ground between where the fans that aren't very good at case airflow, they haven't completely lost all their airspeed, so it's dissipated a lot, they've slowed down a lot, but it's not completely gone to crap. While the fans that are good at case airflow are still pushing rock solid amounts of air, so that you really start to see these fans diverge from each other rather than like hiding information at that 6-inch mark, which doesn't tell you as much of a story. And realistically, I could have a graph for like every single one of my data points, but that would be a lot of graphs. The Light Wings is sitting here kind of right there in the middle, again kind of doing okay, but it's not great. There are other fans that are worse, but there are a lot more fans that are better. BeQuiet, like Light Wings 120. Now we're taking a look at how the fan pushes air through my CPU cooler. I use a Noctua U12A. The cooler itself has a fairly tight fin stack, which makes it very similar to a radiator, while still being fundamentally a air cooler. So it's sort of this middle ground between the two in my mind, so that it gives you some indications of how a fan will perform when in a true pressure application. In the future, I do hope to acquire a solid radiator to perform that kind of testing on. But anyways, the left graph here is RPM versus airspeed, and essentially that is a blade efficiency test. It is how efficient are the fan's blades at pushing air through that radiator, yes, our heatsink, I should say. On the left graph, or right graph, what am I saying? We have noise versus airspeed, and that is how efficient the fan is at moving air for a given noise value. So noise efficiency. So our blade efficiency, noise efficiency. RPM is the bottom, noise is the bottom on the right one, and both verticals are airspeed. And right away we can see that both fans are actually pretty blade efficient. Matter of fact, the Silent Wings 4 Pro, the Silent Wings 4 Pro is the most efficient, but the Light Wings is putting up a great fight following matching my control fan. In both these graphs, good fans are in the top left area. When we take a look at the right graph, we start to see kind of a little bit more of a difference here. So both the fans do appear to outperform my control fan in noise normalized testing through the cooler, which is pretty remarkable. But the light wings is actually the better of the three quote-unquote fans. But how do these fans compare against, well, everything else on the market? Well, it performs pretty well. So up first is noise normalized values. The light wings is sitting right here at 1.7 meters per second of airflow. Now, a few notes that I want to make about this graph before we really dive into it. Over here, we have this legend of data. It has basically a number with a W, that is the CPU wattage, equals airspeed. So that is a particular airspeed traveling through it that equates to a wattage. In another video, I did a full analysis of what is the maximum cooling potential of my CPU air cooler. Basically in that video, I slowed the fan RPM down basically to everything and saw what wattage my CPU drew, where the only thing limiting it was its temperature, and it was hitting its temperature max of 91 degrees C. So the only variable was adjusting the airspeed, and I let the CPU just draw whatever wattage it could to basically get whatever clock speed it could. And I put together some nice graphs, and this is the data that popped out basically. So I know roughly what airspeed I need to achieve a wattage on my CPU, and my CPU is an i7-11700K. If you have the same CPU as me and the same cooler as me, these results will be very similar for you. However, if you have a different CPU than me but the same cooler, those wattages will not be the same because the way a CPU utilizes its wattage is different, meaning where the hotspots are for cooling. The second part of it is, if you don't have the same cooler as me, how can you use this data? Well, it applies the same way as you would use this data for going through a radiator, AIO, or heatsink. If you have a fan, let's say like the NFF12, I found it to be relatively noisy for its airspeed. Well, let's say you jump up to the light wings. Well, you've added a full meter per second of airflow to the NFF12's, basically what it could achieve before at the same noise level. So that means for the given noise level, you're going to get more performance out of your CPU. Or you can take that extra, basically, RPM or extra airflow that you've achieved and slow that fan down a little bit more, and it will be quieter. If, let's say, you find my noise level to be noisy for you, you could then quiet the fan down and achieve the same wattage for less noise. But note with everything that there are points of diminishing returns. So as wattage goes up, the CPU's difference in clock speed that you're able to achieve becomes less and less and less. And also as airspeed increases going through your heatsink, radiator, AIO, whatever, the amount of extra heat you can extract does diminish over time. It becomes harder for it to extract more heat as airspeed increases going through it, which I know is kind of funny, but that's just the way it is. At some point, it can't pick up any more heat. So if you have a very dense fin stack, that point is much further away. If you have a much less fin stack, then that point happens much earlier. I should also note at this time the error in my measurements for my anemometer. So I have an off-the-shelf anemometer, and it is accurate to within plus or minus decimal point 0.1 meter per second. So fans like the Wonder Snail and the Tuffan 12 could be considered functionally equivalent. Even the A12X25 could be considered functionally equivalent to the Tuffan 12. However, I repeated the tests for all these fans several times, and the averages always hold true that this is their placement. But it's just the error in the instrumentation, and you can negate it by doing the test several times. Taking a look at things at 100% PWM fan signaling, And we can see the light wings just doesn't have the same sort of top end as many other fans. Mind, it's not in a bad position. It's actually doing quite well at 2.1 meters per second. It's slightly outperforming the Noctua A12X25, though at slightly higher RPM, but by my current testing methodology, at slightly lower noise values. At this time, I also want to talk about, I have a whole new set of videos coming out. While I was actually in the process of making this review, I'm in the process of redoing all the fans that I've previously tested with a new noise testing methodology. It's not ready yet, and the data isn't ready yet, but with my current test methodology, I find that the accuracy is plus or minus 4 decibels. And a note about decibels is that it's not a linear progression. It is a quadratic or progression where every 10 decibels increase in noise value is actually a doubling of that noise volume. So comparing like 20 decibels to 30 decibels is twice as loud as 20 decibels. So my old way of measuring, that is a pretty significant difference in that noise value. And with the new one, it's looking like I'm looking at more like 2 decibel difference. So I hope you're looking forward to that. And I'm going to have basically not videos for every single fan, but I'm going to be talking about every single fan and talking about how they've changed places, because I'm expecting some things to be shaken up, because with the current way of testing it, I had the microphone test right next to the fan blade, very close to it, and I think I was picking up extra harmonics. Basically the fan blades interacting with the microphone. Now that that explanation is out of the way, I would also like to talk about, I have a Patreon page. I want to acquire better testing equipment. Specifically, first things first is a microphone, and hopefully at some point being able to build a actual test system as opposed to using my gaming rig to do testing. But if you don't have spare cash, I completely understand it, but please hit that subscribe button because that'll help with my YouTube analytics. So back to these fans, the Light Wings is doing okay. It's better than a stock fan on my cooler, but there's certainly better fans out there. Taking a look at the data from a slightly different perspective, where it's airspeed through the cooler versus decibels, so we can see how noise efficient it is. And again, in this graph, better fans are going to be sitting top left, and right here we have the Light Wings. It is performing really quite well. The Silent Wings 4 Pro is sitting right there. So amazingly, the Light Wings appears to be doing better than a more modern fan, the Silent Wings 4 Pro. So clearly, unlike before in case airflow testing, the Light Wings is much better at blowing air through a cooler, because now it's sitting not at the top, but towards the top of the graphs. Last up in my test suite is CFM testing. Now personally, I don't really like pure CFM testing because it's basically a scientific test. You put a fan, you place it right up against a tube, and you blow air down the tube. It completely negates the fact that a fan blows air out to its sides. Mind, there will be a difference between a fan that has a tendency to shoot air off to the sides and one that blows air straight down a tube, even if they have the same quote-unquote CFM value, because the one that's shooting off their sides, it won't have the same kind of moment or true forward air speed. Even though it's drawing through the fan the same amount of air, it's not as efficient at blowing the air down it, but they will be closer to the same value than what we saw from my case airflow test. In essence, a CFM test is very good at also looking at pretty much radiator and cooler testing, because those applications are somewhat similar in that you're blowing air through something, and that something has a tendency to straighten out the airflow going through it. Now that all of that is out of the way, how did it perform? Well, in RPM versus CFM, it basically followed my control fan identically. It's exactly the same. Here, the control fan is actually 100% the A12X25, because my testing apparatus for testing 120 and 140 millimeter fans for CFM is different. So that is a special note here. As for noise versus CFM, the light wings is doing a little bit better than my control fan. But how does it rank against every other fan? Well, its results are very similar to what we saw with the cooler testing. It ranks towards the top in noise normalized testing values, beating out like the A12X25, the Corsair AF Elite, Xilinx 4 Pro 120. It is just right there towards the top. At 100% PWM fin signaling, it is still functionally towards the top. On this graph, we have the RPM and the noise value it was doing. So it is doing a lot of performance for the same sort of, actually a lower noise value than several other fans around it. And of course, we have CFM versus decibels, comparing all the fans against each other. And right here is the light wings. And here's some other ones. So once again, just similar to what we saw with the cooler testing, it's moved up and is doing kind of better, sort of top middle, but not at the very peak of performance. Let's go do the open box experience. All right, now that we have the first set of graphs out of the way, let's move on to our open box experience. So it comes in this box. It looks fairly nice. It has some spec information on the back, RPM, voltage, amperage, air pressure in millimeters of H2O, CFM, or meters cubed per hour. And there's that. And inside, we get this handy dandy little box, some screws, and some product information. So overall, pretty basic there. In terms of the cable, it's got two cables, one for RGB, and one for the fan header. So you got twice as many cables to deal with. But that is true for pretty much all RGB style fans. So let's zoom in and take a closer look at the fan design itself. So it's got this halo ring, and we'll take a closer look at the RGB here in a second. It has rubber pads around the outside of the frame, and it has this classic BeQuiet ribs on the fan blades themselves. So these ribs are one part style, one's part function. So BeQuiet decided that this is the style fan that they want, so it's their distinct appearance. But these ribs actually function a useful purpose in that they help guide airflow rather than just letting it roll off the tip of the wing, or fan blade, I should say, as air moves from the inside to the outside. So as this spins, air will try to travel outside, which is why in most fans you actually see the majority of airflow being pushed from the outside. So that's also why you want the minimum amount of gap distance between the blade and the frame itself. So the silent wing, or light wings, I would say it's an average distance. It's not particularly good, it's not particularly bad. The frame on it does look a little bit thicker, so this is a smaller fan. So that means it's a little bit less useful on something like a heatsink. But in a radiator pressure application where it's going to be sealed up pretty nicely and it'll just kind of fill that space, it's a little bit less important. And as we saw from my testing, it did okay in case airflow, so you could use it as a case fan, but it's not the best performance in that category, but it was fine. I would call it adequate. On heatsink performance for that airspeed, it was good in both airspeed and noise. So it would be a good choice on your radiator or your heatsink, particularly on your heatsink if you use it in the front so you get to see the light, because from the back you don't get to really see anything at all. So it'd be kind of a waste in that regard. And you also don't want to use this fan in that pull configuration, because I found it had a high-pitched, medium-level noise. So it wasn't super loud, but it was very noticeable, and it was a very high-pitched. So it'd get old very quickly. And that comes from one part blade design and one part just how close the blades are to the front of the housing. That just causes air turbulence, at least on my particular heatsink, the U12A. Going on to the frame design again, the ring here actually helps to seal it up, because if you look at the frame itself, these indents and gaps that give it a distinct appearance are actually places that air can escape. That reduces how much pressure that this can deliver. But this was in a pull configuration. If you look at the back, it is basically completely flat, which means that it'll seal up very nicely. So that is a very smart decision on BeQuiet's part. I've looked at a bunch of fans that basically had the front and the back mirror images of each other. And if it had an indent gap right there, this fan would not be able to generate the same sort of pressure that it can with this design. So good job, BeQuiet. Good job. In terms of the frame features, these struts are very thick. If they could figure out a way to shave them down a little bit, they could increase the sweep angle on these blades. So the front to the back, just how much curvature that gets in there, and could potentially get even higher performance fan out of this exact same design. But other features on the frame, it doesn't really have anything. It doesn't have a sweeped inlet. It's just the blade and the light ring. The back is very basic. The struts are very basic. So overall, this is a relatively basic fan with a pretty common blade shape in the hybrid design. But its special feature are the ribs that come on all BeQuiet fans. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at the RGB features of the light wings. So this fan features just a halo ring around the central blade, with the blade itself being completely unilluminated. So that means this will create a sort of ring of light in your case while making the fans themselves kind of hide, disappear back into the frame itself. A good way to see how the color blending and how many light sources there are in it, we can turn on sort of the rainbow color where it'll just cycle through all the colors. And you can see in the video where the lights are essentially shining up through it. So it has plenty of LEDs, and visually in person, I can't actually see the lights as they are shining, but in camera, you actually can. And the color blending appears to be very good. So it's a very subtle difference as the ring is going around the purple to blue, the greens to yellows, the reds to oranges. So it looks absolutely fantastic in this regard. So you can have a couple different colors on it, or cycle colors in whatever spectrums you want, and it'll look pretty good. I'm not going to comment as to whether I think this halo ring is the best choice, or have the blade illuminated, or have everything illuminated, but overall I think it looks pretty good. This isn't the best looking RGB in my opinion. I actually like the Squama the best, but it looks pretty good overall. I'm not a super RGB enthusiast, so you have to take everything with a little bit of a grain of salt. I don't pretend to be an expert on it. So this is just visually my opinion on what we're seeing. So I'm just using Armory Crate as my software, so it's just color matching to whatever LED strips are. You're welcome to use whatever software you want to have it do whatever color profiles that you find most appealing. Okay, let's jump into the value proposition. Okay, last but certainly not least is the value proposition. The Light Wings 120 high speed is a $27 fan. So that is a little on the expensive side. So that's going to hurt its performance per dollar. And this is against every other fan, not just RGB fans. And I don't have every single fan listed on this graph, just some like key indicators on it. But we can see that in noise normalized airspeed testing at the 6-inch mark, it is doing quite well overall. At 100% PWM fan signaling, well, you shouldn't be running your case fans at 100%. Something's gone terribly wrong with your cooling system inside the case if it's running at 100%. But compared to other fans, it is pretty far off what I would consider a good fan. Moving up to the 11-inch mark, and it just gets worse. To beat the dead horse, it is not a case fan. Its value is not there. It's performing very, very poorly against every other fan. But the moment we take a look at it in CPU cooling, it has jumped up quite well, especially at noise normalized performance. So it's close to some of the top performers. It is not quite at the peak, but it is closer to the top. I would consider it in a good category. But when we're taking a look at it in 100% PWM signaling, it's kind of dropped back pretty significantly. It is no longer towards the top, but I guess functionally in the middle, despite the fact that many other fans have much better values. But if you're taking a look at where the other fans place, it is functionally kind of middle of the road there. And last, but certainly not least, we have how it performs in the CFM testing. And here, it's pretty much the same story as it ran through the cooler, so there's not much to talk about. So where does this leave us with this fan? Well, I wouldn't recommend it as a case fan, basically, period. If you want to use it on a heatsink, an AIO, radiator, whatever, a cooling apparatus, I think you could safely say that this is an alright fan. If you're only buying it for the RGB as a case fan, I guess it's fine, but there are probably better fans out there. Matter of fact, I think I've tested them. I just haven't included them on this graph yet. Actually, there's the Swama. That's one. And let's see, the Unifan SL Infinity is also on there. So overall, I think it's okay. If you really like the way its RGB looks, then go for it. If not so much, get something else. If you're on an extraordinarily tight budget, you really want to be using this value proposition graph 100% to determine which fans are best for your build. If you've got the extra spending money but still want to get the best bang the buck, then you would use this data in conjunction with well, the rest of the other data to figure out what the best fan is for your particular purpose. And if you got unlimited budget, well, you just pick out whichever fan you want. Which brings me to the end of this video. I'm going to have the raw data pop up next. I really want to thank each and every one of you for watching my video. If you've got constructive criticism for me, please give it to me. I'm always looking to improve my videos and enhance my skills at making them for you all. If there are any fans you want to see me test in the future, please leave them in the comments down below. I'll see if I can get my hands on it to acquire it. Other than that, check out my Patreon page. Please subscribe, and I'll check you out next time on Computer Tech and More. And this is the raw data for the Lightwings 120 high speed. You are welcome to use this data for your own purposes. You can put it in Excel, create your own graphs, whatever you like to do. However, if you do want to use it in any publication, I ask that you reference me and my video, my channel, as the creator of this data, because it was a lot of work creating it. It's a labor of love, but I am the one who created it, so I should be getting credit. It's just the way world works. But yeah, other than that, have a great one, and I'll see you next time.